Phoenix, Seat 12F, Part 1. The weight she carries. The general didn't look up from his desk when she walked in. That was the first sign. In 20 years of Air Force service, Colonel Rachel Voss had walked into hundreds of briefings. She knew every variation of what a superior officer's body language communicated before a single word was spoken. Leaning forward meant urgency. Hands flat on the desk meant containment. Arms crossed meant the decision had already been made before you arrived. General Stuart Holt had his hands folded in his lap. His chair was pushed back from the desk by exactly 6 inches. He was looking at a spot on the wall just above her head. That meant this was going to hurt, and he didn't want to watch it happen. Rachel stood at attention in the center of the room. Peterson Space Force Base, Colorado Springs, February 14th, 2024. Outside the window, the front range was white with snow. Inside, the only sound was the ventilation system and the quiet tick of a clock on the wall that seemed in that moment unreasonably loud. Holt finally looked at her. "Colonel Voss," he paused, "you are grounded effective immediately pending mandatory psychological evaluation. You will report to the evaluation board in Arlington no later than May 1st. Until a final determination is made, you are relieved of all flight duties and squadron command responsibilities." Rachel did not blink. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in a room full of people watching you absorb bad news was let them see the moment it landed. So she held her posture. Back straight, chin level, eyes forward. The way it had been drilled into her at the academy, the way it had become so deeply embedded that it no longer required effort. It was simply the shape her body made when the world applied pressure. But underneath the fabric of her shirt, pressed flat against her sternum, a thin chain shifted slightly as her chest expanded with a single controlled breath. She felt the dog tag move. She always felt when it moved. Holt cleared his throat. He wasn't a cruel man, she understood that. He was doing a job that required him to deliver certain kinds of news to certain kinds of people, and he had learned the way all generals eventually learned to keep his face professionally neutral while doing it. "The evaluation process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks," he said. "You'll receive full documentation from the board within 48 hours. If cleared, you'll be reinstated with full command privileges." He paused. "If not, I understand, sir." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Dismissed." She walked out of that building into the February cold and stood on the steps for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. The mountain air hit her face like something honest. Around her, the base moved with its ordinary rhythms, vehicles, personnel, the distant sound of aircraft on the far side of the field. Life continuing indifferent to the weight any one person happened to be carrying at any given moment. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against her chest, felt the small rectangle of metal beneath the fabric. Her father had stood on steps like these once, in a place very much like this one. He had walked out of a building and into cold air and had pressed his own hand against his own chest where his own dog tag rested. And then he had driven home, and then he had never flown again. That was 1992. Rachel Voss had been 12 years old. She was 44 now. History had a particular appetite for repetition. The flight from Denver to Washington was scheduled for departure at 1:15 in the afternoon. Rachel arrived at the gate 40 minutes early, not because she was anxious, but because arriving early was simply the way she moved through the world. You surveyed your environment before committing to it. You understood the layout. You identified the exits, the variables, the people who seemed like they belonged, and the ones who carried something slightly off about them. Some small signal in posture or eyes that most people were trained not to see, and she had been trained to notice immediately. She found seat 12F, the window seat she had requested specifically, and settled into it with the economy of movement that comes from years of occupying small functional spaces. Her carry-on was stowed before the overhead bin was fully open, secured in the corner handles forward. She sat with her back straight and her feet flat on the floor, and her hands resting open on her thighs, and she looked out the window at the gray tarmac and the gray sky, and tried with genuine effort to feel like a person who was simply catching a flight. She was wearing jeans. A dark blue sweater that her sister had sent her for Christmas 2 years ago, and that had hung untouched in her closet because there had been nowhere to wear it. Low boots, no insignia, no rank, no call sign stitched onto anything. Just a woman in a window seat. That was the goal. That was the whole point of the next 4 hours. To be nobody in particular, heading somewhere ordinary for reasons that were entirely her own. The dog tag rested against her sternum, cold and familiar, the way it had rested every single day for 31 years. The aircraft filled in waves and clusters in the individual processions of people who each believed on some level that the overhead bin above their specific seat was a reserved personal space that other passengers violated at genuine moral cost. Rachel watched them without appearing to watch them. 20 years of flying combat had wired her nervous system for this, not surveillance exactly, but the constant low-level processing of a mind that had learned at significant cost that the difference between a threat and a non-threat was often a detail most people decided wasn't worth noticing. The man who settled into the aisle seat appeared before she heard him coming, which told her something about how he distributed his weight and moved through space. He was somewhere in his early 40s, with the slightly loosened look of someone who had started the day in a pressed shirt and a strong opinion about his quarterly numbers, and was now 7 hours into a grinding business crisis conducted entirely over a Bluetooth headset operating on coffee and controlled desperation. His name, she would later learn, was Grant Holloway. He had a laptop open before the seatbelt sign finished its first illumination cycle, and within 90 seconds he was deep inside a spreadsheet that seemed to cause him genuine physical pain. Across the narrow aisle, a young woman was performing the controlled chaos of a parent managing 2 toddlers in an aircraft seat. The boys were identical, 3 years old maybe, with the same wide eyes and the same capacity for generating noise at frequencies the Boeing 757 was not specifically designed to accommodate. The woman, whose name was Diane Merritt, had the cheerful, exhausted competence of someone who had accepted with profound grace that her life for the foreseeable future would be conducted at a noise level slightly above comfortable. She was pointing out of the window to the boys, narrating the runway, converting the ordinary into the miraculous through sheer maternal enthusiasm. Her husband was asleep in the seat beside her. He had the sleep of someone who hadn't slept properly in a very long time. The collapsed total sleep that doesn't care about posture or noise or the angle of the headrest. His head was tilted back. One hand rested loose in his lap. He was wearing civilian clothes, a gray t-shirt and dark jeans, and there was nothing about him that announced what he was, except for one thing. His left sleeve had ridden up slightly as he slept, just enough to show the unit patch tattooed on the inside of his forearm. Rachel's eyes moved to it the way water moves toward low ground. Not a choice. Gravity. She knew that patch. She knew it the way you know the shape of something you have seen in the dark from above, at 300 knots in the 30 seconds before everything that happens next determines who lives and who doesn't. F.O.B. Chapman. Kunar Province, Afghanistan. November 14th, 2022. A night she did not discuss with anyone for reasons that were classified and also for reasons that were simply hers. She looked away. She looked back at the window, at the gray tarmac, at the ordinary machinery of departure. This man had been one of the figures below her aircraft on that night in that valley, in that country, and there had been a moment when the question of whether he would be alive in the morning had passed directly through her hands. He was asleep 3 feet away from her. His children were fighting over a small red toy car across the aisle. She pressed her palm very briefly against her sternum. Then she put her hands back in her lap and tried again to feel like nobody in particular. In row 8, a man in a charcoal suit was not enjoying himself. This was not unusual. Many people in charcoal suits do not enjoy themselves on aircraft. But Gary Whitfield's discomfort had an inward-focused quality, the quality of a man not anxious about flying, but about something that flying was temporarily preventing him from managing. He checked his phone at intervals too short to be casual. He typed messages with the focused urgency of someone conducting damage control on a situation that had not yet fully caught fire, but was showing strong indications it intended to. He had a FAA identification card in the inner pocket of his jacket, visible for perhaps 2 seconds when he reached inside for something, then gone again. Rachel noted it. 3 rows behind her, almost directly aft of where she sat, a woman of about 60 was reading a paperback novel with the quiet concentration of someone who had mastered the art of being invisible in public spaces. She had gray hair pulled back, simply no jewelry, except small gold earrings, and a composed, watchful stillness that most people would read as introversion, and that was in fact something considerably more purposeful than that. The woman had not turned a single page in 40 minutes. Her name was Dr. Patricia Calloway. Rachel did not know that name, not yet. Claire Ashworth had been a flight attendant for 12 years, and she had developed in that time a precise and accurate taxonomy of passengers based entirely on observable behavior in the first 3 minutes after boarding. There were the arrangers who spent those 3 minutes achieving perfect control of their immediate environment. The surrenderers who accepted the fundamental indignity of commercial aviation with philosophical resignation she genuinely respected. The performers who needed to be seen managing their own sophistication. The worriers who needed quiet ongoing reassurance. The checked outs who had already left their bodies and were simply waiting for their location to catch up. The woman in 12F was none of these. She was sitting with a stillness that was not relaxation. It was the opposite of relaxation, the stillness that comes from a nervous system so thoroughly trained to manage itself under pressure that it can produce the appearance of calm through pure discipline alone, the way a compressed spring looks from the outside, exactly like an ordinary object. Claire noticed the way the woman's eyes had moved when she boarded. Not casually around, but systematically. The exits, the wing spars visible through the windows, the overhead compartments, the galley, the cockpit door, each assessed and cataloged in a sequence too deliberate to be unconscious. And then just once the woman's right hand moved to her chest, just long enough to press something beneath the fabric of her sweater. Claire had been married to a Navy man for 22 years. Senior Chief Petty Officer Thomas Ashworth, retired. 3 deployments to the Gulf, 2 to the Pacific. She knew what that gesture meant. She had seen Thomas do it 100 times, reaching for something small and metallic that lived close to his heart, touching it the way a religious man touches a cross. Not for anyone else, just to confirm it was still there. Claire poured coffee for the woman in 12F with the precision of someone performing a small act of acknowledgement. The woman looked up. "First time flying commercial in a while?" Claire asked. A pause, very small. "Something like that," the woman said. She offered a smile that was genuine and also carefully controlled the smile of someone who meant well by you, but had decided for reasons she was keeping entirely to herself to remain at a certain distance. Claire filed this away the way she filed everything that didn't quite fit the expected pattern, not with alarm, but with the quiet attention of someone who had learned that the details people tried to suppress were usually the ones worth remembering. At 1:17, 2 minutes behind schedule, United Flight 847 pushed back from the gate at Denver International Airport and began its slow taxi toward runway 16L. In seat 12, if Rachel Voss watched the terminal slide past the window and held herself with genuine effort to the instructions she had been given by the man she trusted most in the world, which was her father, who had offered it from memory when she was 11 years old, sitting in the front seat of his truck outside a diner in Colorado Springs, watching a thunderstorm come down off the mountains. He had said, "There will be days when the job is just to sit still and let things happen around you. Not every situation is yours to manage. The hardest thing for a pilot is understanding that sometimes the bravest act is keeping your hands off the controls." She had been thinking about that conversation a great deal lately. The aircraft turned. The engines climbed toward takeoff power. The familiar sequence of forces acceleration pressing her back, the subtle lightening as lift asserted itself, the precise moment of rotation when the geometry of the aircraft changed its relationship to the earth, moved through her body with the intimacy of a language she had been speaking since before she could speak any other. She knew this in her cells. Wheels left the ground. Denver tilted and fell away beneath the left wing. The grid of streets and the glint of the South Platte River and the white line of the mountains she had flown over more times than she could count, all of it receding into the pale winter sky. She exhaled. She was just a passenger. She told herself this with some conviction. The flight reached cruising altitude at 141, and for a while things were what flights at cruising altitude tend to be. Grant Holloway conducted his crisis management with the intensity of a man who had decided to treat commercial aviation as a mobile office and was going to make it work through sheer professional will. Diane Merritt distributed snacks to her sons with the strategic precision of someone who understood that the difference between a manageable situation and an unmanageable one was often the timely deployment of crackers. Her husband slept on his breathing slow, and even his left sleeve still showing the edge of the tattoo Rachel was doing her best not to look at. She was not entirely succeeding. It was not something she examined or named. Her eyes kept finding their way back to that forearm, with the persistence of water finding the lowest available point. Each time they did, her mind produced briefly and involuntarily the image of a valley at night seen from altitude, all thermal signature and geometric precision, beautiful and cold, and entirely abstract until it resolved into the specific truth of what she was actually doing and for whom. She looked out the window. Kansas was below her now. The same flat geometric patchwork it had always been, wheat fields and irrigation circles, and the tiny arteries of county roads connecting small towns to smaller towns. The whole quiet immensity of Middle America spreading out like a map of the life she had spent 20 years protecting from above. She thought about her father. She did this often, but never more than on days when the Air Force had reminded her directly and formally that it had the power to take from her the same thing it had once taken from him. James Voss had been, by every available account, one of the finest tactical pilots of his generation. He had come up in the era of the F-4 Phantom, and transitioned with what his squadron commanders consistently described as extraordinary aptitude through the F-15 and eventually into the early F-16 program. He had flown in the Gulf War, had logged combat hours in theaters that Rachel still did not know the full details of, had earned a collection of commendations that filled a frame on the wall of her mother's home in Arlington, and that Rachel had memorized as a child the way other children memorize baseball, statistics, or song lyrics. He had been by every measure. She understood how to apply exactly the kind of pilot that the Air Force exists to produce. In 1992, 1 year after returning from the Gulf, he was ordered to undergo mandatory psychological evaluation. Standard procedure, they said, post-deployment protocol. Nothing personal. He did not pass. The reasons were never fully disclosed to the family. Rachel's mother received a letter with language about fitness for duty and continued monitoring requirements in a list of available support resources that had the form of kindness without its substance. What it meant practically was that James Voss was removed from flight status permanently. He was 39 years old. He did not take the ground assignment they offered him. He submitted his retirement paperwork instead because he was the kind of man who could not imagine doing the work without being allowed to do the most essential part of it, and he did not know how to explain that to anyone who had not felt it themselves. He was gone 14 months later. A car accident on a mountain road outside Colorado Springs. A clear day, a road he had driven 100 times. Rachel had been 13. She took his dog tag from the box of effects the Air Force delivered to her mother's front door. She had worn it every day since, not only as memorial, but as something harder to name. As a question, she was still in the process of answering. The tag read Voss James R. USAF. Below it, in much smaller text, barely legible, after 3 decades of wear, scratched in his own hand, never just a passenger. She had asked her mother once what it meant, and her mother had thought about it for a long time and then said, "It means he believed that if you're somewhere and something is happening, you have a responsibility to be part of how it turns out." Rachel had been 15 when her mother told her that. She had known even then that she was going to spend her life trying to live up to it. The flight attendant came back through at 2:20 with coffee refills, and Rachel accepted the cup and held it in both hands and watched the clouds below and tried to do nothing in particular. It was, she discovered again, harder than it sounded. Every few minutes, her mind generated unbidden a piece of information she hadn't asked for. The aircraft's heading had shifted 2 or 3 degrees east of the filed flight plan. The engines had adjusted power slightly at 37,000 feet. Gary Whitfield in row 8 had not touched his in-flight service, had barely moved, had spent the last 40 minutes in the tight, inward-focused posture of a man who was profoundly unhappy about something and managing that unhappiness entirely through his telephone. She registered all of this. She did not act on any of it. Then she opened the small side pocket of her carry-on and took out the envelope. She had been carrying it since early that morning. Handed to her at Peterson after the briefing by a junior officer who had not made eye contact while delivering it and had left the room quickly afterward, which told her something about what people on the base had been told about why she was grounded. The envelope had her name on it. Below her name, a case number. Below that, the formal letterhead of the Air Force Psychological Evaluation Board. She had read the letter twice already. She knew what it said, the dates, the location, the process, the possible outcomes explained in the careful bureaucratic language that government documents use when they want to sound both authoritative and compassionate simultaneously. What she examined now was the bottom of the page, a small paragraph formatted differently from the rest. Smaller font. The kind of thing that could look, if you were reading quickly, like a standard procedural footnote. It read, "Evaluation protocols for this case include extended behavioral observation in non-operational environments. Observation period is active from date of notification. Evaluator assigned," she read it again, then a third time. Observation period active from date of notification. That meant now. It had meant now since the morning, since the moment that junior officer had handed her this envelope and left the room. It meant that someone with a specific professional mandate was watching her, not in a briefing room or a clinical setting, but here in the ordinary world, in the places where she was trying to be, nobody in particular. Someone on this flight was watching her right now. She did not know who. She put the letter back in the envelope, put the envelope back in her bag, looked out the window at Kansas and felt the dog tag against her sternum and thought about her father standing on the steps of a building in winter cold with his hand pressed against his chest. She thought, "I will not become what they decided he was." She thought, "I will walk into that building in Arlington on April 30th, and I will sit in that room and I will show them every single thing they need to see." She thought, "But first I have to get there." And then just as that thought completed itself, she felt it. It started in her feet, a vibration low and persistent moving up through the floor of the aircraft and into the frame of her seat and into her spine, a frequency her body recognized before her mind had fully named it. Not turbulence. Turbulence has a randomness to it, a chaotic quality, a stuttering irregularity that feels like the aircraft being pushed around by something external. This was internal. The aircraft itself was generating it from somewhere deep in its mechanical structure, a pulsing rhythmic tremor that repeated at too regular intervals to be random and at too low a frequency to be normal. She had felt something like this before, not on a commercial airliner, on an F-16 at 25,000 feet over Kandahar province, when her hydraulic pump had begun its final stages of mechanical failure. A vibration in the floor plates, rhythmic, persistent. The aircraft speaking in the language of machinery, announcing that something fundamental was about to go very wrong. She put both hands on the armrests. She looked straight ahead. Around her, the cabin continued its ordinary business. Grant Holloway was typing. Diane Merritt was negotiating with her sons about something involving a snack wrapper. The college students a few rows back were laughing about something on a phone. Nobody else had felt it, or if they had filed it under turbulence and moved on. The aircraft knew something the passengers didn't. Rachel knew what the aircraft knew. She pressed her back against the seat and heard her father's voice in the place where certain memories live, preserved, not as recordings exactly, but as something alive that continues to speak if you're quiet enough to let it. Sometimes the bravest act is keeping your hands off the controls. She breathed. She waited. 30 seconds later, the intercom chimed. Captain Douglas Mercer's voice came through the overhead speakers, carrying the modulated calm of a professional man doing his best to keep something very large and very serious inside a container, labeled minor inconvenience. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. We're going to need everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts while we sort this out. Minor technical difficulties. Rachel had used those exact words herself once. She knew what they meant. She knew them the way you know a translation when you understand both languages. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, felt the dog tag, and looked out the window at the American heartland, below the fields and roads and small towns and the lives being lived in them, and understood with a clarity that required no analysis that whatever she had been trying to be for the last 4 hours was already finished. She had never actually been just a passenger. She had just been waiting for the moment that made it official. Part 2, what she was built for. The vibration lasted 11 more seconds. Then it became something else entirely. The aircraft didn't shake the way aircraft shake in turbulence. Turbulence is a conversation between a plane and the atmosphere, uncomfortable but fundamentally external, the sky pushing against the machine. What happened at 2:31 over eastern Colorado was not a conversation. It was the machine itself arguing with its own internal architecture, the deep structural shudder of a system fighting against the failure of something it absolutely required in order to function. Rachel felt it change before anyone else registered that anything had changed at all. The floor beneath her feet transmitted it first. A new frequency layering over the first, slightly higher, slightly more urgent. Then the airframe itself, the walls, the ceiling panels, the window frame beneath her left hand, all of it beginning to resonate at the same frequency, the way a tuning fork will make everything near it hum if you hold it close enough. Her coffee cup moved across the tray table by itself. Grant Holloway looked up from his laptop with the mild annoyance of a man interrupted in the middle of something important by something he was not yet prepared to classify as important. Across the aisle, Diane Merritt pulled her son slightly closer. The instinct of a woman who did not yet know what was wrong but whose body had already decided her children should be nearer to her than they currently were. Ben Merritt did not wake up. The shaking intensified over the course of perhaps 8 seconds, going from noticeable to undeniable, and then the overhead compartments began rattling in their housings, and a carry-on bag shifted loudly somewhere toward the back, and someone behind Rachel made a sound that was not quite a word, just the involuntary vocalization of a nervous system registering threat. Then the intercom chimed. Captain Mercer's voice carried the quality Rachel recognized as professional composure under genuine stress, the voice of a man trained to sound calm, sounding calm but with something tight and carefully controlled underneath it, the way things are controlled when they require active effort to contain. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for emergency procedures. Passengers, I need everyone to review your safety cards and prepare for a possible emergency landing. The word emergency. It entered the cabin the way smoke enters a room, silently at first, then everywhere, then impossible to ignore. Grant Holloway's laptop snapped shut. Diane Merritt pulled both sons onto her lap simultaneously, one arm around each of them, her face transitioning in a single breath from cheerful exhaustion to focused maternal determination. The college students 3 rows back went completely silent. Somewhere near the back, someone began to pray in a low, rapid voice, the words tumbling over each other with the urgency of a person who had been saving this conversation for a genuine emergency and had decided this qualified. The oxygen mask dropped from the overhead compartments with a collective exhalation. Yellow cups swinging on their elastic tethers, the cabin suddenly filled with the visual language of crisis that everyone recognized from safety demonstrations and had privately hoped never to see deployed in actual use. Ben Merritt woke up. He came out of sleep the way combat veterans come out of sleep, fully immediately, without the transitional phase most people require. Eyes open and posture changed before he had consciously processed what woke him. His first movement was to reach across and put his hand on his wife's arm, not in panic, but in the way that people trained for emergencies reach for the people they are responsible for. Rachel was already reaching for her mask. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. 12 seconds. That was all it required. She had spent 20 years learning to read the language that aircraft speak when they are in distress, and this aircraft was speaking clearly the way a patient in pain is clear when the pain has passed the threshold of what can be politely concealed. The vibration pattern, the way the nose had moved, that subtle left-right oscillation indicating the pilots were using differential input to compensate for something that should have been handled automatically. The change in engine tone that most passengers would process as background noise, but that told her with considerable precision what was no longer working and how long the compensation could plausibly continue. Primary hydraulic system, gone or close enough that the distinction was academic. The backup had engaged and was losing the argument. They were in manual reversion, which meant the flight crew was controlling 180,000 pounds of aluminum in fuel and human life through cable linkages and raw physical effort. 8 minutes, maybe 10. She pressed the mask over her face. She breathed the thin, recycled air. She thought 8 minutes. Then the aircraft's nose pitched forward and the floor dropped away beneath her feet, and the horizon through the window tilted to an angle it had no business being at, and the ordinary panic that had been building in the cabin released itself all at once, filling the space with the sound of human beings confronting the specific ancient terror of being very far above the ground with no visible means of controlling how far above the ground they remained. Claire Ashworth was moving through the cabin before the masts had stopped swinging. 12 years of emergency training had prepared her for panic in its various forms. She knew how to project calm into a space that had lost it. She knew the language of reassurance, the tone and pacing, and the words that could, in the right circumstances, anchor people to a version of themselves capable of following instructions. She moved with the efficiency of someone performing a function, rehearsed hundreds of times, checking masks, making eye contact, placing a hand briefly on the shoulder of a man hyperventilating with a thoroughness that suggested he had decided if he was going to do this, to do it completely. But as she moved through the tilting cabin, her attention kept returning to row 12. The woman in 12F had her mask on. Her hands were on the armrests. Her posture had not changed in any way Claire could detect, not a single additional degree of tension, not a millimeter of additional rigidity. She looked the way she had looked when she boarded, except that now the aircraft was pitching into an uncontrolled descent, and everyone within 20 feet of her was operating on some level of visible fear. She was simply sitting there with her eyes moving across the cabin with the quality of someone who was not frightened but was processing. Their eyes met. The woman pulled her mask aside, just far enough to speak. Claire. She used her name, first name, without hesitation, the way you use someone's name when you need them to understand you are speaking to them specifically and not to the general situation. I need to talk to the captain. Claire's training surfaced immediately. Ma'am, I need you to keep your mask on and remain in your... I'm a pilot, the woman said, not loudly, not with the aggressive insistence of a passenger who wanted to be important in a crisis. She said it the way you state a credential when the credential is directly relevant to the immediate problem, and there is no time for a longer explanation. United States Air Force. I've dealt with hydraulic failures before. Multiple system failures specifically. I need to talk to whoever is in that cockpit right now. Claire looked at her for 2 full seconds. The aircraft shuddered again, a deep structural tremor that sent something sliding off a tray table 3 rows back and produced a sound from the rear of the cabin that no sound on a commercial aircraft should sound like. What kind of pilot? Claire asked because she needed to know. Fighter pilot, F-16S primarily, but I've flown everything from trainers to heavy transports. I've brought aircraft home from situations that should not have been survivable. She held Claire's gaze without effort. I've been exactly where your captain is right now. I know what he's feeling, and I know what this aircraft has left. Please." Claire Ashworth had been married to a Navy man for 22 years. She knew what it looked like when someone was telling the truth about something that mattered. She reached for her key. "Follow me," she said. The intercom was mounted in the galley between the forward exit and the cockpit door. Rachel picked it up without asking because there was no time to ask, and because the 4 seconds it would have taken to request permission were 4 seconds the cabin did not have to spare. Her voice when she spoke into the handset was calibrated with care. The volume and register of a human voice that a nervous system responds to by becoming slightly less afraid, authoritative and reassuring, simultaneously saying, "I know what is happening, and you are going to be all right," without ever using those words. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Rachel Voss, United States Air Force. The cabin went quiet in a way that cabins do not go quiet except when something has cut through the noise with enough clarity to reach everyone at the same time. I want everyone to listen carefully. We are going to get through this. The flight crew is doing exactly what needs to be done. I am going to assist them. Your job right now is to follow every instruction from the cabin crew, keep your masks on, and trust that the people responsible for this aircraft know what they are doing. She paused for exactly 1 second. We are going to bring everyone home. That is not reassurance, that is a statement of intent. She put the handset back. Grant Holloway caught her eye as she moved toward the cockpit door. He was pale. His laptop was closed. His hands were flat on his armrests, and his knuckles were the color of old paper. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. She said nothing. She didn't need to. He nodded a small, tight movement, the nod of a man who had decided to place his trust in a specific location and was committing to it completely. Claire unlocked the cockpit door. Rachel went through it. What she found on the other side was a scene she understood completely, and that was in its understanding deeply alarming. F/O Wendy Briggs was working. That was the right word. She was not panicking. She was not frozen. She was moving through the emergency checklist with the methodical precision of someone who had trained for this situation many times and was performing it now, under conditions that training had not fully prepared her for, because training never fully prepares you for the weight of it when it is real. Her hands moved across the instruments with competence and purpose. Her voice calling out checklist items was steady enough to be functional. She was entirely alone in it. Captain Douglas Mercer was in his left seat, physically present, hands on the controls. The aircraft was in the most technical sense being flown, but the specific quality of his presence, the angle of his head, the stillness of his shoulders, the way his eyes were focused on a point slightly beyond the windscreen, rather than on the instruments directly in front of him, communicated something that Rachel's nervous system registered before her analytical mind had words for it. He was somewhere else. Not in this cockpit, not in this emergency. He was in another cockpit at another moment on another day, when the same sequence of sounds and vibrations and mechanical failures had produced an outcome he had been carrying ever since, in the place where certain kinds of failures live permanently. Briggs glanced up. She saw Rachel. Her expression moved through surprise towards something that wasn't quite relief, but sat adjacent to it, the expression of a person who has been handling something alone that should not be handled alone and has just been joined. 5 years ago, Briggs said quietly, her voice pitched below the ambient noise of the emergency, a passenger didn't make it. Different failure, same sound. She looked at Mercer for a fraction of a second. He's been holding it. But when the backup engaged, Rachel nodded. She understood. She moved to the jump seat behind and between the two pilots, settling into it with the economy of motion that comes from years of occupying cockpits not designed for her presence. She reached for the headset hanging beside the seat, put it on, and took 2 seconds to read the instrument panel the way you read a page of text in a language you know, not word by word, but in complete thoughts, the whole situation resolving in a single act of comprehension. 22,000 feet descending, airspeed 190 knots. Attitude indicator showing a 4-degree nose-down pitch with oscillating lateral movement. Autopilot disengaged, someone flying manually. The hydraulic pressure gauges told the story she had already constructed from the feel of the aircraft primary system at 0 secondary at 11% and falling the backup pump running at maximum capacity and achieving less than a quarter of the output required for normal flight control authority. Manual reversion confirmed. Full cable linkage, no hydraulic assist. Every control input required moving the control surfaces through brute mechanical force. 7 minutes, maybe 8 if the backup pump held. Denver International was 18 minutes away at current speed. She had already done this arithmetic. She leaned forward. "Douglas," she said, "not Captain Mercer, Not sir. His first name, the way you call someone back from a place they have gone to involuntarily, the way you call to a person across a distance that has nothing to do with geography. He turned. His eyes found her face and held there. She could see the two things happening simultaneously in them. The automatic professional response that 23 years of training produced, and underneath it, the specific thing that certain experiences leave in certain people. The thing that does not go away, but can, under the right conditions, be moved aside long enough to function. She had felt the same thing herself. She knew what it looked like from the outside because she had seen it in the mirror. I know what you're carrying, she said. Directly. Not gently, not harshly. Directly. I am not here to take your airplane. I am here to fly it with you. Everything that comes next you and I do together. Your aircraft, your crew, your passengers. She held his gaze without releasing it. But I need you here. Present. All three of us. Something moved in his face. It was not dramatic. Not the cinematic moment of a man suddenly transformed by the right words at the right time. It was smaller and more honest than that, the movement of a person who has been alone with something very heavy and has just been offered help carrying it and is deciding in real time whether to accept. He accepted it. His hands adjusted on the yoke. His shoulders dropped 1 millimeter. His eyes came back to the instrument panel with the quality of attention she needed them to have. Primary and secondary are gone, he said. His voice was rough but functional. Manual reversion. I've got maybe 30% control authority. Denver is too far. I know, Rachel said. Buckley Air Force Base, 14 miles closer. Long runways, military crash equipment. They know how to handle approaches that look nothing like the textbook. She reached for the radio. I'll talk to approach control. You fly the airplane. She keyed the microphone. Denver Center United 847. This is Colonel Rachel Voss, United States Air Force, call sign Phoenix. I am assisting the flight crew with emergency procedures. We are declaring full emergency. Request immediate vector to Buckley Air Force Base in full emergency services. Confirm traffic clearance within 20 miles. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was not the silence of an empty frequency. It was the silence of a room full of people registering something they did not expect to register. Then United 847 Denver Center, confirm call sign Phoenix, Colonel Rachel Voss. Confirm Denver Center, Phoenix on station, total hydraulic failure, manual reversion only. We need that vector immediately. The controller's voice when it came back had acquired a weight it had not carried before. United 847, you are cleared, direct Buckley, turn left heading 090, descend, and maintain 10,000. All traffic is being diverted. Full emergency services notified. Colonel Voss, you are cleared to operate however you deem necessary. She gave Mercer the heading. He turned to it. The aircraft's response was sluggish, the heavy reluctance of machinery being asked to move without the systems designed to move it, a delay between input and output that required anticipation and constant ongoing adjustment. Mercer was doing this. His technique was sound and his hands were steady. Whatever had taken him away from this cockpit for those critical seconds had returned to wherever it normally lived when it wasn't being triggered. Rachel watched. She called airspeed and altitude as they descended. Briggs continued the checklist. The three of them fell into the rhythm that emerges in extremis between people who understand their function within a system and execute it without requiring that everything be explained. 2 rows behind the cockpit door, Gary Whitfield had his phone pressed close to his ear. He was speaking in the controlled low voice of someone who wanted to be heard by exactly one person and was aware he was surrounded by people who might also hear him if he wasn't careful. Grant Holloway had not returned to his laptop. He had been staring at the seat back in front of him for 12 minutes, holding his armrest, doing what people do when they have decided the most useful contribution they can make to their own survival is to remain completely still. His noise-canceling headphones were around his neck. He had put them there when the emergency was announced and had not replaced them because something told him this was not a moment for noise cancellation. The instinct was correct. He was not trying to overhear the man in row 8. But the cabin had gone extraordinarily quiet. The peculiar silence of 127 people, all holding something in reserve, all running internal processes that required more cognitive resources than usual and therefore left fewer resources available for generating ambient noise. In this silence, Whitfield's voice carried, not all of it, not enough to follow as a conversation, but fragments. The maintenance log from Tuesday, Whitfield said, before NTSB gets here. A pause. I understand the exposure. Another pause longer. Then handle it. That's what I'm telling you to do. Holloway turned his head very slightly. He was not a man accustomed to emergency situations. He was a financial consultant from Scottsdale who spent his days worrying about market exposure and quarterly projections and the structural integrity of leveraged positions. But he was also a man who had built a career on understanding faster than most people when a number told you something different than the story surrounding it. The maintenance log from Tuesday. Tuesday was 3 days ago. This aircraft had been flying since Tuesday. If a maintenance flag had been raised and not addressed, and if the hydraulic system had failed today, then those two facts had a relationship to each other that was not coincidental. He took his phone from his jacket pocket. He opened the voice memo application. He set the phone on his knee screen down and did not look at it again. The red indicator light was invisible against the dark fabric of his trousers. Across the aisle and 2 rows back, Ben Merritt was awake and had been since the announcement. He had one arm around Diane, who was holding both boys in her lap with the contained fierceness of a woman who had decided nothing was going to happen to her children that she did not personally authorize. He was speaking to them in a low, steady voice, telling them the airplane was going to be all right, telling them the same thing that soldiers learn to tell each other in the moments before an operation, the words that are not predictions but are commitments. He had watched the woman in 12F walk to the cockpit door. He had watched her move through the tilting cabin with exactly the quality of purposeful motion he had seen in precisely one context in his life. That context had been a military installation in a foreign country under conditions he was not going to think about right now. He watched her disappear through the cockpit door. He looked at his wife. He said, "It's going to be okay." He believed it, not because he had reason to believe it in any rational sense, but because of the way that woman had walked toward the front of the aircraft. Because of something in the set of her shoulders and the quality of her movement that reminded him precisely of watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing approach a situation that needed someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He had seen that before, under very different circumstances. He just didn't yet know where. At altitude 240 miles from Denver Major, Jake Sullivan was running through a pre-mission checklist he had not expected to be running when he woke up that morning. The scramble order had come through his personal phone first, which was unusual, and told him something about the unofficial nature of what was being requested, and then through official channels, approximately 90 seconds later, which told him the unofficial had become official fast enough to compress the normal bureaucratic timeline considerably. The reason had been stated in 4 words. Phoenix is on board. He had been flying F-22 Raptors out of Buckley for 4 years. Before that, F-15 at Langley. Before that, T-38 trainers at Columbus, where an instructor pilot named Captain Voss had spent 6 weeks teaching him that the difference between a pilot who survived emergencies and a pilot who didn't was not reflexes or intelligence, but the ability to maintain analytical function while every physical system in your body was screaming for a different kind of response entirely. He had not told her at the time how much that changed the way he flew. He thought he might have the opportunity to tell her today. He keyed his radio. Denver Center Hawk Flight, Flight of 2, checking in. Request vector for intercept United 847. Hawk Flight, Denver Center. United 847 at your 11 o'clock 14 miles descending through 16,000 on vectors to Buckley. Be advised, Phoenix is in the cockpit. Sullivan's wingman, Captain Thomas Brearley, said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, like the Phoenix, Sullivan said, "Yeah." Another pause. "Then let's not embarrass ourselves," Brearley said. They turned to the intercept heading. Rachel was watching the altimeter and working through the approach arithmetic when the flashback arrived. This was the nature of what she carried. It did not announce itself. It did not build gradually from background to foreground. It arrived fully formed in the space between one breath and the next, the way a door opens into a room you were not expecting to enter. The sound was what triggered it, not a dramatic sound, just the combination of the straining hydraulic backup pump and the vibration frequency of the aircraft under manual reversion and some third element. She couldn't isolate some harmonic in the engine. Note that her nervous system had cataloged on a different aircraft on a different day and stored in the location where certain memories are kept, the ones not available for rational retrieval, but that surface on their own terms, according to their own schedule. Kunar Province, November 14th, 2022. Darkness and cold, and the targeting display resolving into thermal signatures below. The radio traffic, the voices. The moment when she understood what was being asked of her and said yes without hesitation. Then what happened after she said yes, all of it, arriving simultaneously in the present moment with a completeness and physical reality that made the present moment temporarily unavailable. 8 seconds. The cockpit continued its emergency around her. Briggs said something. Mercer's hand made an adjustment on the yoke. 8 seconds during which the aircraft was at 11,000 feet over the eastern Colorado plains, and the runway at Buckley was 6 minutes away, and she was not available in the way she needed to be available. Then Wendy Briggs said her name. Sharp. Professional. The voice of someone calling a person back from a place they have no business being when there is work that requires their immediate presence. Colonel Voss. She came back. The cockpit reassembled itself around her, with the clarity that follows this kind of absence. Everything slightly sharper, slightly more present, the way the world looks, when you have just been reminded that it is real, and that it requires something specific from you. Douglas Mercer was flying the airplane. His hands were on the yoke and his eyes were on the instruments, and he was flying with the focused, competent engagement of a 23-year professional doing the thing he had spent 23 years learning how to do. In the moment she had been unavailable, he had not frozen. He had flown. She looked at him, he looked at her. There was a recognition in his face she felt in her own body, the face of someone who has just done the thing he wasn't sure he could do in the moment when doing it was not optional. The face of someone on the other side of a threshold. She had been on that side herself. She put her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement. The physical communication between people who have operated together in extremis that says, I see you. I know what that was. We are not done. I'm here, she said, level clear, entirely free of performance. You've got this airplane. Douglas, I've got you. Briggs. She glanced at her first officer. Both of you, let's bring them home. Mercer breathed. He nodded once. He turned back to the instruments. Outside, the cockpit windows appearing off the right side of the aircraft with the grace of a machine, doing exactly what it was built to do, a gray F-22. Raptor settled into formation position 500 feet off the wingtip. Then a second one. The radio crackled. United 847 Hawk Flight has you in sight. A pause containing something that was not quite reverence but rhymed with it. Phoenix, it's Sullivan, we're with you. Rachel looked at the two fighters holding formation in the clear Colorado air and felt something that sat in the territory between relief and recognition, and the specific quality of being known by people who understand the nature of what you do and have come without being asked to stand beside you while you do it. She keyed the microphone. Hawk Flight, good to see friendly wings. 1 second, then forward. Jake, I need you talking to Buckley. Approach right now. Runway clearance, full emergency services, and tell them, this approach is going to be nothing like the manual. We're coming in fast, steep, and we're going to need every foot of that runway they have. Already coordinating Phoenix, whatever you need. She turned back to the instrument panel. 8,000 feet. Buckley was 4 minutes away. Mercer was flying the airplane. She was flying it with him. Through the windows, the Colorado plains stretched ahead in the late afternoon light, and somewhere out there on the concrete expanse of a military airfield, people were positioning vehicles and preparing equipment and doing the things that people do when they have been told something difficult is coming and they intend to be ready for it. Rachel Voss settled into the jump seat, put both hands on her knees, and looked forward at what was coming. She thought of her father. She thought of a piece of paper he had written on once a long time ago, in the careful, technical handwriting of a man who understood that the things he knew might one day need to outlive him. She had the knowledge from that paper. She had it in the place where the things that matter most are kept. She was going to need it very soon. Part 3. What fire forges? The runway appeared at 2 miles out. Rachel saw it through the windscreen as a gray ribbon against the darker gray of the Colorado plains, precise and geometric, and in that moment the most welcome sight she had ever seen from altitude. The late afternoon sun was behind them, casting the aircraft's shadow long and thin across the scrubland below, and the shadow moved with them like a companion that had been waiting at this altitude for this specific moment. Gear down, she said. Mercer reached for the handle. The gear extended with the hydraulic groan of a system operating at the edge of its remaining pressure, each component moving with a deliberateness that communicated in the language of machinery, in extremis, that it was doing what was asked of it and that this had required more effort than it should have. The indicator lights cycled through their sequence. Green for the mains. A pause that lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have, then green for the nose. Rachel looked at the nose gear indicator for 1 extra second. She looked away. She did not say what the indicator had told her. Not yet. There are things you do not introduce into a cockpit during final approach unless the crew can immediately act on them, because a cockpit in final approach carries enough cognitive demand already, and information that cannot yet be acted upon serves no one. What she had seen she filed in the place she kept contingencies. The things you prepare for without announcing that you are preparing for them. Airspeed 185, Briggs called. Her voice had the quality of someone who had been maintaining steadiness for a long time and was going to maintain it for as long as steadiness was required regardless of what that cost. Good, Rachel said. Douglas, we are going to come in hot and stay hot until the mains are down. Do not flare early. Everything in 23 years of flying is going to tell you to slow this aircraft down before it touches ground. I am telling you that instinct is wrong today. Today we land with energy. We trade the energy for control, and we let the runway do the work of slowing us down. Do you understand? Understood, Mercer said. His voice was the voice of a man who had crossed back over some threshold and was fully present in the only moment that existed. Briggs called out the altimeter. 500 feet, 400. The runway was filling the windscreen now. The centerline lights coming on in the early dusk, and the emergency vehicles were visible along both sides in a formation that would have been impressive under any circumstances and was under these the most organized expression of human solidarity Rachel had ever seen from altitude. 39 vehicles, fire suppression units positioned at the first and second thirds of the runway. Ambulances staged at intervals, chosen by someone who had thought carefully about where they would be most useful, depending on where the aircraft came to rest. Military helicopters holding at a safe distance off the north end of the field. Someone had done this correctly. 200 feet. Airspeed 182, Briggs said. 100. Flare now, Rachel said. Easy back pressure, slow and steady. Let her settle. Mercer's hands moved. The nose came up 2 degrees, then 3. The rate of descent decreased by a number Rachel felt rather than calculated, the subtle shift in the aircraft's energy as the wings changed their relationship to the oncoming air and began at the right angle and the right speed to resist what gravity was asking of them. 50 feet, the runway threshold passed beneath them. 30. Mercer held the flare with the consistency that told her everything she needed to know about what 23 years of professional aviation produces in a person who has found his way back to himself inside a crisis. 20. 10. The main gear touched the runway, not violently, not with the hard slap of an aircraft dropped from height onto concrete. With the quality of contact that happens when a pilot manages energy correctly and the machine and the ground meet each other with something approaching mutual agreement. A firm, solid touchdown, a sound that traveled through the airframe and through the seats and through the bodies of 127 people as the precise physical notification that they were no longer in the air. The cabin erupted, not in panic. In its complete opposite, the involuntary vocalization of relief, of gratitude, of the emotion that surfaces when the worst thing that seemed like it was going to happen has against reasonable expectation not happened. People were crying, people were laughing, someone was applauding with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a person who had never before fully understood what applause was for. Diane Merritt had her face pressed against the top of her elder son's head and her eyes closed. Ben Merritt had both arms around his family and was staring at the ceiling of the aircraft with an expression not readable in conventional terms but entirely readable to anyone who had ever experienced the gratitude that follows very close proximity to the end of everything. Mercer said, "We're down." He said it the way you say the thing you have been working toward for the entirety of a crisis, the words carrying the weight of everything that preceded them. Rachel said, "We're not done." She said it without emphasis, without drama, a statement of fact, because it was a statement of fact, and because the next 15 seconds were going to require everything the three of them had left. Mercer heard her. He looked at the airspeed indicator. 70 knots. The reverse thrust was working the engines howling in the register of machines being asked to push against the direction of their own momentum, the aircraft shaking with the effort of deceleration. The runway ahead was finite. That was the fundamental truth of runways. They ended. This one would end in approximately 1,200 meters, and they were still moving at a speed that translated in practical terms to faster than most people drove on a highway. 65 knots. 60. Rachel was watching the nose gear indicator in her peripheral vision. At 58 knots, it told her what she had suspected since the gear extension sequence and had held in the contingency file without announcing. The nose gear locking mechanism had failed. A partial failure, the kind that holds until it doesn't, the kind that had been holding since the gear came down and was now at 58 knots, with deceleration forces working against every weakened component in the system, not going to hold much longer. 4 seconds, maybe. She did not announce what was about to happen. Announcing it would have consumed 2 of those 4 seconds and produced no useful outcome. She reached forward and said one word to Mercer. "Throttles." He understood. Not because she had explained it, because 23 years of flying had produced a nervous system that could in certain moments recognize the shape of an instruction before it was fully formed, could understand from a single word and the quality of the voice saying it that something specific was required immediately. His hands went to the throttle levers. Asymmetric, Rachel said. Right engine 30%, left engine idle. Now. He moved the levers. The effect was immediate and violent and entirely intentional. With the right engine producing thrust and the left at idle, the aircraft yawed, nose swinging left against the centerline tail. Moving right, the whole fuselage rotating around a vertical axis in a motion that no airline manual described as a landing technique, and that was in the precise technical sense an act of last resort. It was also the only available option. The asymmetric thrust produced a force vector that worked against the nose-down pitching moment of the collapsing gear, not by preventing the collapse, but by redistributing the load, transferring the weight and energy of the aircraft's momentum through the mains rather than the nose, keeping the mains loaded and the nose light in the fraction of a second between the gear failing and the nose structure contacting the runway surface. This technique did not exist in any civilian flight manual. It existed on a piece of paper in a dead man's handwriting. The nose gear went. It went with a sound that entered the aircraft through the floor, and the walls simultaneously a grinding metallic report, unlike any sound that belonged in an aircraft cabin, and the nose dipped and the floor tilted forward by 6 degrees, and somewhere in the cabin, a voice made a sound that was not a word, and for one full second the aircraft was doing something it was not supposed to be able to do. Then the mains bit harder into the runway surface, and the friction rose, and the deceleration curve steepened, and the nose stopped descending at 6 degrees, and the aircraft wounded, and asymmetric trailing, a thin line of sparks from the abraded nose structure, continued forward. 40 knots. 30. 20. The aircraft came to rest. Nose 6 degrees low. The runway centerline running through the windscreen at a slightly wrong angle. Engines winding down with the sound of machines that had been asked to do a great deal and were grateful to stop. Outside the windows, the emergency vehicles were already moving, the carefully staged formation coming to life with the coordinated purpose of people who had prepared for exactly this outcome and were now executing their preparation. The aircraft was stopped. Everyone was alive. Mercer sat in his seat and did not speak for 4 seconds. Then, in a voice carrying the full weight of everything the last 45 minutes had been, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Buckley Space Force Base." He paused. "We have arrived." Rachel took the headset off. She set it on the console. She placed both hands on her knees and looked at the instrument panel and took one breath that was longer and slower than all the breaths that had preceded it. Not relief exactly, but the breath of someone who has been running a very long calculation and has arrived at the final number and is taking one moment to acknowledge that the calculation is complete before beginning whatever comes next. Whatever came next was getting 127 people off this aircraft. She stood up. The evacuation was organized. This was the result of training and of the quality of calm that Claire Ashworth and her cabin crew had maintained through the emergency, the landing, and the aftermath. The professional composure of people who understood their function was not complete. When the aircraft stopped moving, but only when every person aboard had transferred from the aircraft to the ground. The slides deployed. The doors opened. The late afternoon Colorado air entered the cabin with the quality of outdoor air entering an enclosed space that has been under pressure, immediate and real, carrying the smell of aviation fuel and prairie grass and the metallic scent of emergency vehicles positioning outside. Passengers moved with the focused efficiency of people who have recently made a private and profound renegotiation with the value of their own lives and are now in possession of a clarity about what matters that they did not have 90 minutes ago. Grant Holloway helped the elderly couple from row 15 navigate the aisle. Ben Merritt had his sons in his arms and was moving toward the exit with the patient, deliberate speed of someone who was not going to rush, but was absolutely not going to stop. Diane Merritt was right beside him, her hand on his back, her expression, the expression of a woman who had decided something in the last 45 minutes and was going to spend the rest of her life living according to that decision. Tyler Brooks, 8 years old, was trying to see out every window simultaneously. Rachel came out of the cockpit last. She spent 4 minutes completing a shutdown sequence that no one had asked her to complete and that she performed anyway, methodically and carefully, moving through the items, the way she moved through all technical processes with the attention the process deserved, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. It was what her father had taught her. You finished what you started. You closed out what you opened. You left things in order. She came through the main door and descended the portable stairs in the Colorado evening air, hit her face the way it had hit her face on the steps of a building at Peterson 3 months earlier, honest, clean, and entirely indifferent to what you were carrying. She was still wearing jeans, still wearing the dark blue sweater her sister had sent her for Christmas. No insignia, no rank, no call sign visible anywhere. She stepped off the last stair and onto the tarmac. What she found there took a moment to fully register. They had come from the base, from surrounding installations. Active duty personnel in flight suits and dress blues in the working uniforms of people who had been doing something else when word reached them and had stopped doing it and come here instead. Retired veterans in civilian clothes carrying the bearing that decades of military service leaves in a body even when the uniform is long gone. Families. Civilian aviation workers from the field, standing in formation. Not because anyone had ordered them to. There had been no formation order. There had been, as best as Rachel would later understand it, a spontaneous recognition that this moment called for a specific kind of acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement had a form that military people understood instinctively, and so they had taken that form. At the front, still in his flight suit, stood Major Jake Sullivan. His wingman, Captain Thomas Burley, stood beside him. Behind them, the formation extended back into the gathering dusk in two lines that were straight in the way lines formed by people who have spent years caring about straightness are straight. Sullivan's eyes found her. He came to attention. He rendered a salute with the precision of someone who understood this was not a routine gesture and was treating it with everything that understanding implied. The formation followed him. Every person present came to attention simultaneously. The sound of it was audible. The collective shift of weight, the alignment of posture, the quality of attention that the military salute represents when it is rendered by people who mean it without reservation. Rachel stood at the base of the stairs in her civilian clothes and held this moment for what it was. She came to attention. She returned the salute. She held it for the 3 seconds the situation required. Then she brought her hand down and stood at ease and looked at the people in front of her and said nothing because nothing she could say would have added to what was already present in that moment. She had spent enough time in command to know when silence was the correct response. Sullivan stepped forward out of the formation. Colonel Voss. His voice was the voice of a man who had prepared something to say and decided at the moment of saying it that the preparation had been unnecessary. "It's good to see you on the ground." "It's good to be on the ground," she said. Behind him, the formation dissolved naturally into the less formal assembly of people who have shared something and are now in each other's presence on the other side of it. People moved toward her, faces from different chapters of her career, different bases, different deployments, different moments that had meant something at the time and had continued meaning something afterward. A master sergeant she had served with during her second rotation. A pilot she had trained at Columbus, who was now an instructor pilot himself. A crew chief who had serviced her aircraft at Bagram and who approached now with the directness of an enlisted man who had decided that military formality could accommodate a brief suspension. "Colonel," he said, "you brought another one home." She looked at him. "We brought it home," she said. "All of us." Grant Holloway founded the FBI agents without difficulty. They were part of the emergency response team conducting the orderly, methodical process of beginning an investigation into the causes of a hydraulic failure that had very nearly killed 127 people. Holloway approached the senior agent, a woman in her 40s, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been managing complex situations for a long time, and he opened his phone and played the recording. The agent listened. She listened a second time. She looked at Holloway with an expression that was professionally neutral and contained beneath its neutrality a quality of recognition. "Is the individual present?" she asked. Holloway looked across the tarmac to where Gary Whitfield was standing near the passenger assembly area, still in his charcoal suit, phone in hand posture, carrying the quality of a man who had been hoping the chaos of the aftermath would provide sufficient cover for a number of urgent communications and was now beginning to understand that it had not. "Yes," Holloway said. Two agents crossed the tarmac. Whitfield saw them coming. He did not run. He had the look of a man who had understood some minutes ago that running was not available as an option and had spent those minutes in the private process of accepting what came next. When the agents reached him, he was calm, in the way that people are calm when the thing they have been dreading has finally arrived and turned out to be exactly the shape they expected. No drama. Just the quiet procedural weight of a consequence meeting the action that produced it on a tarmac in Colorado in the gathering dusk, while 30 feet away, the passengers of United Flight 847 were being processed by medical personnel and reunited with the ordinary facts of their lives. Tyler Brooks found her by the straightforward method of walking in the direction that seemed right and not stopping until he reached her, which was the method 8-year-olds apply to most problems, and which in this instance worked perfectly. His mother was somewhere behind him, and she had said his name twice in the tone that meant, "Don't go too far," but Tyler had a piece of paper in his hand and a purpose, and these were sufficient. Rachel saw him coming. She watched him cross the tarmac with the confidence of a child who has not yet learned to question whether he is welcome in a given space and simply occupies it. He stopped in front of her and looked up with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of someone not yet old enough to feel social pressure to look away. "Are you the pilot, lady?" he asked. "I help the pilots," Rachel said. "Captain Mercer and First Officer Briggs flew the airplane." Tyler considered this with genuine seriousness. "But you were in there too," he said. "I was in there too." He held out his boarding pass, crumpled from being held in a small hand for a long time, slightly damp at one corner. He also held out a pen, his mother's crossword pen borrowed without asking, which was something he would address later. Rachel took the pen. She crouched down, bringing herself to his level the way she had always crouched down when talking to someone whose perspective she wanted to meet rather than look down at. She looked at him for a moment. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tyler Brooks." "Tyler." She smoothed the boarding pass against her knee. "Do you know what I've learned about being brave?" He shook his head. "Brave isn't a thing you are," she said. "It's a thing you do, and you do it when the people around you need you to, not because someone is watching, but because it needs to be done." She began to write. "Today, everyone on that airplane was brave, including you." She handed the boarding pass back. He read what she had written with the careful effort of a child working through cursive lips moving slightly. Then he looked up. "My dad says you're famous," he said. "Your dad is generous," Rachel said. He thought about this with genuine consideration. "I'm going to be a pilot," he announced, with the finality of a decision just made and not subject to revision. Rachel looked at him. "Aim high," she said. He nodded once, the nod of tremendous 8-year-old seriousness, and then turned and ran back toward his mother in the way that children run when they are carrying something important and want to show someone immediately. Rachel watched him go. She straightened up. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt a dog tag and stood on the tarmac in the last of the Colorado daylight and thought about a man who had taught her on a piece of paper and in the front seat of a truck, and in the particular way he moved through the world, everything that mattered about what she had just done. Ben Merritt came to her as the medical teams were completing their assessments, and the crowd on the tarmac was thinning into smaller groups, having smaller, more private conversations. He came alone. Diane had both boys in her arms nearby, watching him go, with the patience of a woman who understood that some things needed the time they needed. He stopped in front of Rachel. He was a medium-height man in a gray t-shirt with the physical quality that soldiers carry. Not size exactly, but density, the quality of a body put through a specific kind of use over a long period of time. His eyes were dark and clear and held the expression of someone who has arrived at the place they have been moving toward and is now standing in it. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this," he said. Rachel gave him the space to do it whatever way he needed. "F.O.B. Chapman," he said, "Kunar Province, November 14th, 2022. He said the date the way soldiers say dates that matter with precision because he had reviewed this date many times and had it fixed in a location that does not blur with time. "We were pinned down, northeast corner. The outer wall was gone. We had wounded and we had maybe 20 minutes before—" He stopped, choosing how much of this to say out loud. There was an aircraft overhead, F-16, single ship. It came in on a strafing run that should not have been possible at that angle in that terrain at night. 3 passes. Then it was gone." He paused. "The threat was gone. We got our people out." He looked at her steadily. Rachel held his gaze and said nothing. "I never knew who was in that aircraft," he said. "Command said the mission record was classified. I've thought about that pilot a lot every time I look at my kids. Every time I understand that the reason I have a family is partly because of a decision someone made at altitude about a valley they'd never seen from the ground." Rachel stood very still. The evening air moved across the tarmac. "Was that you?" he asked. Not with urgency, not with the demanding quality of someone who needs the answer for themselves. With the quiet sincerity of someone who needs to know where to direct something they have been carrying without an address. She looked at him. She looked past him at Diane holding their sons, watching from a distance, with the patience of a woman who understood that some moments needed the time they needed. She looked back at Ben Merritt. "Go home to your family, soldier," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once. Something moved in his face that she recognized from the inside, the movement of a weight being set down in a specific place in a way that it can remain without being carried. He turned and walked back to his wife and sons, and she watched him reach them and put his arms around all three of them at once and stand there in the middle of the tarmac with his face pressed against his family like a man who has been reminded of what he is standing on and intends never to forget it. She watched this for as long as it took to see it fully. Then she walked away. She found a quiet place at the edge of the tarmac where the emergency vehicles had been and were no longer a stretch of concrete that had returned to its ordinary function of simply being the surface between the aircraft and the earth. The mountains were visible to the west, the last light catching the snow on the high peaks and turning it the gold that Colorado evenings produce in the hour before full dark. She heard footsteps. She turned. Doctor. Patricia Calloway was walking toward her from the direction of the passenger assembly area. Same clothes she had worn on the aircraft, moving with the unhurried directness of someone who has been patient for a long time and is now prepared to stop being patient. She stopped 3 feet from Rachel and opened the identification case she was carrying. Military Psychological Evaluator, United States Air Force. The photograph matched the face. The credentials were current. The authorization number at the bottom corresponded to the case number printed on the letter in Rachel's bag, the letter she had read on the aircraft with its small, dense paragraph about observation periods and assigned evaluators. Rachel looked at the ID. She looked at Calloway. She understood, in the space of 2 seconds, everything she needed to understand about why this woman had been on this flight, what she had been doing there, and what the last 4 hours had represented in a context larger than the emergency that had defined them. "You were watching me," Rachel said. "That's correct." "Since the gate." "Since Denver," Calloway said. "I was on the earlier flight. I rebooked to yours when I saw you at the terminal." She said this without apology, with the directness of someone who understood that the person in front of her had the right to know what had been done and was entitled to the unvarnished version of it. Behavioral observation in non-operational civilian environments, as the documentation describes it. Rachel said nothing. The wind moved across the tarmac from the west, carrying the smell of the mountains and the cooling evening and the residual heat of engines that had worked very hard. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Then she did something Rachel had not anticipated. She reached up and placed her hand flat against her own chest in the center of her sternum, in exactly the position where Rachel's hand went when it moved without permission toward the dog tag. It was not a coincidence. It was too precise and too deliberate to be anything else. "Your father," Calloway said, "James Voss. He was evaluated in 1992 by a board I served on as a junior consultant." Yeah, she said this evenly, not as confession, but as a fact that had been carried for a long time and was now being set down. "I was 28 years old. I disagreed with the board's determination. I filed a minority opinion that was noted in the record and not acted upon." A pause. "I have thought about that opinion every year since." The tarmac was very quiet around them. "The technique you used," Calloway said, "the asymmetric thrust, for the nose gear." Rachel waited. "Your father's flight notes," Calloway said. "The Air Force retained them when he retired. They've been in archive storage at Peterson for 30 years. He developed that technique from combat experience and documented it in personal technical notes. He submitted it to the training command in 1991 for consideration as an emergency procedure. It was declined without being incorporated into any curriculum." She held Rachel's gaze. It was never formally credited to him. Rachel felt the dog tag against her sternum. She did not reach for it. "I found those notes," Calloway said, "when this case was assigned to me, when I understood who I was evaluating." She reached into her jacket and withdrew an envelope. It was sealed with a case number that matched the number on Rachel's documentation. "I read his technique. I recognized it when you used it on the runway. I had already signed this before the main gear touched down." She held the envelope out. Rachel took it. She turned it over in her hands. The paper was slightly warm from being carried inside a jacket through a landing that had been many things but had not been routine. She did not open it. She already knew what it said. Calloway looked at her steadily. "Your father was not unfit to fly, Colonel Voss. He was carrying something that the system of 1992 did not know how to address and responded to by removing the thing he loved most. That was a failure of institutional imagination, not a judgment on who he was." She paused. "What you did on this aircraft today was not an accident of circumstance. It was the product of 20 years of the kind of person he was committed to raising." Another pause. Shorter. "I'm sorry it took this long." Rachel stood on the tarmac with the envelope in her hand and looked at the woman who had been watching her for 4 hours and said nothing for a moment long enough to contain everything that needed to be inside it. Then she said, "Thank you." 2 words. She said them with the full weight they deserved, the unreduced weight of what she meant, which was larger than gratitude and older than today, and had the gravity of things that had been waiting a very long time to be said. Calloway nodded once. She walked back toward the passenger area. Rachel stood alone. She found a place at the very edge of the tarmac, away from the vehicles and the voices and the organized machinery of the aftermath. The mountains were dark now, the last gold completely gone, the peaks reduced to their essential shapes against a sky that still held a thin line of pale blue along the western horizon. She reached into her collar. She pulled the dog tag out from under her sweater and held it in her palm. It was warm from being against her skin. The warmth of something kept close for a long time, carrying in its temperature the temperature of the person who carried it. The metal was worn smooth at the edges where her fingers had found it 10,000 times over 31 years. The stamped letters still legible. Voss James R. U. SAF. And below it, in the scratched-in script that was not standard issue, the words he had put there himself. She read them. Never just a passenger. She thought about what those words had cost him. The shape of a life organized around that principle, the belief that presence required participation, that being somewhere and doing nothing when something was needed was a form of absence more profound than physical distance. She thought about the evaluation that ended his flying, and the minority opinion filed by a junior consultant, too junior to change the outcome, but unable to stay silent. She thought about a set of flight notes sitting in archive storage for 30 years, containing a technique the training command had declined, and that had tonight on a runway in Colorado been the difference between a story about an accident and a story about a landing. She thought about the 32 years between then and now, what they had cost, what they had built, what it meant that the thing that had broken him was also the thing carried forward through her that had kept 127 people alive. She wrapped her hand around the tag and held it. She took her phone from her pocket. The call connected on the second ring. Her mother's voice said her name, just her name, Rachel. The way a parent says a name when a name is sufficient for everything that needs to be said. Mom. Level. She kept her voice level the way she had kept it level for 20 years, through situations that did not favor levelness. I'm on the ground. Everyone's safe. A pause on the line. I watched it, Rachel, her mother said. The whole thing. They had it live. Rachel looked at the mountains. She thought about what her mother had watched. The emergency coverage. The F-22 escorts. The approach. The landing. On all of it on a television screen in a house in Arlington by a woman who had once watched a different kind of news about a different aircraft, news that had arrived not on television, but in the form of a uniformed officer at the front door. She thought about what it had meant to her mother to watch this one land. Mom, she said. She stopped. She had intended to say something else, something steady and composed and appropriate to the moment. But what came out was just the one word at a frequency she could not maintain control over. And she knew it because she felt it before she heard it, felt it in her throat and behind her eyes, where the things that have been held back for a very long time eventually collect. She did not speak for 3 seconds. Her mother waited. She was good at waiting. 30 years had made her very good at it. He would have been good at this, Rachel said. Her voice was the voice of someone who is not going to cry and is crying, both of those things true at once. He would have been so good at this. Her mother said he was Rachel. Through you, he was. The pale blue line along the western horizon held for another minute, the way Colorado evenings hold on to the last light longer than seems reasonable, as if the sky understands that some evenings are worth keeping a few minutes more than others. Then the light went, and Rachel Voss stood on the tarmac in her jeans and her sister's sweater, and she let it be exactly what it was. She did not manage it. She did not shape it into something more appropriate or more controlled. She simply stood there and felt the full weight of 31 years and a dog tag in her hand and a voice on the phone saying the things she had needed to hear, and she cried with the uncomplicated completeness of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place where setting it down is possible. In her pocket, the envelope from Dr. Calloway remained unopened. She knew what it said. She would read it later. She would begin the process of returning to the life the Air Force had placed on hold. She would walk back into the buildings and the briefing rooms and the cockpits, and she would do what she had been trained to do. But that was later. Right now, there was just the phone in her hand and her mother's voice and the dog tag warm in her palm with its worn letters and its scratched-in words that a man had put there himself before the world had decided what to do with him. She held it up in the last trace of light, just for a moment, long enough to read it one more time. Voss James R. USAF. Never just a passenger. She closed her fingers around it. She put it back against her chest, against her skin, where it had lived for 31 years and where it would go on living. Rachel Voss turned away from the mountains. She walked toward the lights.